Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing at the base of a mighty stone castle as the sun sets behind its towering walls. The air is cool and carries the scent of wood smoke from the village below. Above you, banners flutter from the battlements, their colors fading in the golden twilight. A drawbridge creaks as it rises for the night, chains rattling against ancient wood. Somewhere within those walls, knights are gathering in the great hall, their armor gleaming in the firelight as servants bring platters of roasted meat and flagons of wine. This is the medieval world, a time of castles and crusades, of knights and kings, of chivalry and chaos. A world that seems distant and romantic to us now, but was filled with very real people living very real lives, facing challenges we can barely imagine. Tonight, we journey back nearly 1,000 years to explore the medieval period, that long stretch of history between the fall of Rome and the dawn of the Renaissance. For roughly 1,000 years, from the 5th century to the 15th, Europe was shaped by feudal lords and peasant farmers, by the power of the church and the clash of swords, by devastating plagues and magnificent cathedrals. This was an age of contrasts, where breathtaking beauty existed alongside terrible cruelty, where faith inspired both soaring architecture and brutal persecution, where the bonds of loyalty could mean everything and nothing at all. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow quiet as we step through the castle gates into a world of stone and steel, of horses and honor, of darkness and flickering candlelight. Fact 1. The medieval period, also called the Middle Ages, lasted approximately 1,000 years, from around the year 500 to around 1500. Historians traditionally divide this vast span of time into three parts. The early Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, stretched from about 500 to 1000, a time of upheaval following the collapse of the Roman Empire. The High Middle Ages, from about 1000 to 1300, saw the flowering of medieval civilization with the construction of great cathedrals, the founding of universities, and the launching of the Crusades. The Late Middle Ages, from about 1300 to 1500, witnessed devastating plagues, prolonged warfare, and the gradual transformation that would lead to the Renaissance. Each of these periods had its own character, but all shared the fundamental structures of medieval society. Fact 2. Medieval society was organized according to the feudal system, a complex web of relationships based on land and loyalty. At the top sat the king, who theoretically owned all the land in his kingdom. Below him were the great nobles, dukes and earls and barons, who held their lands from the king in exchange for military service and counsel. These nobles in turn granted portions of their lands to lesser lords, who granted lands to knights, who might grant lands to even smaller landholders. At the bottom of this pyramid were the peasants, who worked the land and produced the food that supported everyone above them. Each level owed obligations to those above and below, creating a society bound together by duty and mutual dependence. Fact 3. The relationship between a lord and his vassal was formalized through a ceremony called homage. The vassal would kneel before his lord, place his hands between his lord's hands, and swear an oath of loyalty and service. In return, the lord would grant the vassal a fief, usually land but sometimes an office or the right to collect certain revenues. This relationship was deeply personal and theoretically unbreakable. A vassal who betrayed his lord was guilty of the worst crime imaginable, while a lord who failed to protect his vassal violated the most sacred bonds of medieval society. These ties of loyalty and obligation held medieval society together in a world without strong central governments or professional bureaucracies. Fact 4. Castles were the most distinctive structures of the medieval period, and they served multiple purposes beyond simple defense. A castle was a military stronghold designed to resist attack and dominate the surrounding countryside. It was also a residence for the lord and his family, a center of administration for his lands, a symbol of his power and status, and sometimes a prison for his enemies. The earliest castles were simple wooden structures built on earthen mounds, but over the centuries they evolved into the massive stone fortresses that still capture our imagination today. Every element of castle design had a military purpose, from the thick walls that could withstand battering rams to the narrow arrow slits that protected defending archers. Fact 5. The motte and bailey was the earliest type of castle built in medieval Europe, appearing in the 10th and 11th centuries. The motte was a large mound of earth, either natural or man-made, topped with a wooden tower called a keep. The bailey was a courtyard at the base of the motte, surrounded by a wooden palisade and often a ditch. These castles could be built quickly, sometimes in just a few weeks, making them ideal for establishing control over newly conquered territory. After William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, his forces built hundreds of motte and bailey castles across the country to control the hostile population. Though the wooden structures have long since rotted away, the earthen mounds of many motte and bailey castles can still be seen in the English countryside today. Fact 6. Stone castles began replacing wooden ones in the 11th and 12th centuries, offering much greater protection against fire and assault. The earliest stone castles centered on a massive rectangular tower called a keep or dungeon, which served as the lord's residence and the last line of defense if the outer walls were breached. The Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror shortly after his conquest of England, is one of the most famous examples of this type of castle. Its white tower, built of pale stone shipped from Normandy, dominated the city of London and served as royal residence, treasury, armory, and prison for nearly 1,000 years. The thick stone walls, some 15 feet thick at the base, could resist any weapon then known. Fact 7. Castle design evolved constantly as attackers developed new methods of assault and defenders developed new methods of protection. The introduction of round towers in the 12th century eliminated the vulnerable corners of square towers, which could be undermined or battered more easily. The development of concentric castles, with multiple rings of walls each higher than the one before it, created layered defenses that could be held even if outer walls fell. Improvements in gatehouse design transformed the castle's most vulnerable point into its strongest, with multiple gates, murder holes for dropping stones or boiling liquids on attackers, and arrow loops covering every approach. Each generation of castle builders learned from the successes and failures of the past, creating ever more sophisticated fortifications. Fact 8. The gatehouse was often the most heavily fortified part of a medieval castle because gates were the most obvious point of attack. A well-designed gatehouse might include a drawbridge that could be raised to prevent approach, a portcullis, which was a heavy iron grate that could be dropped to block the entrance, multiple sets of heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, murder holes in the ceiling through which defenders could attack anyone who breached the outer defenses, and arrow loops in the walls allowing defenders to fire on attackers from protected positions. Some gatehouses included rooms where the gatehouse could be held as an independent fortress even if the rest of the castle fell. Fact 9. The walls of a stone castle were designed to resist both direct assault and the slower process of siege. Walls might be 15 to 20 feet thick at the base, tapering as they rose to heights of 30 feet or more. Battlements along the top, alternating high and low sections called merlons and crenelles, allowed defenders to shelter behind the high sections while firing through the low sections. Machicolations, projecting galleries with openings in the floor, allowed defenders to drop stones, boiling water, or other unpleasant substances on attackers at the base of the walls. Some walls were built with a sloping base called a batter, which made them more resistant to battering rams and caused objects dropped from above to bounce outward into attackers. Fact 10. Life inside a medieval castle was far less comfortable than modern movies might suggest. Even the grandest castles were cold, drafty, and dark for much of the year. Glass windows were expensive luxuries, so most windows were covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth that blocked light along with wind and rain. Heating came from fireplaces, which warmed only a small area around them while smoke filled the room. Artificial lighting came from candles and oil lamps, which provided dim, flickering illumination and constant fire risk. Privacy was almost unknown, with servants and retainers sleeping in the same rooms as their lords, often on simple straw pallets spread on the floor each night and gathered up each morning. Fact 11. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life, where the lord conducted business, entertained guests, and fed his household. In early castles, everyone from the lord to the lowest servant ate, worked, and often slept in this single large room. The lord and his family sat at a raised table at one end, while everyone else sat at long trestle tables that could be dismantled and stored after meals. Entertainment might include musicians, jesters, storytellers, or visiting minstrels who traveled from castle to castle singing songs of heroic deeds. The Great Hall was also where justice was administered, disputes settled, and the business of managing the lord's lands conducted. It was a public space where the lord displayed his wealth and generosity to all who entered. Fact 12. Sanitation in medieval castles was primitive by modern standards. Toilets, called garderobes, were small chambers built into the thickness of the walls with stone seats over shafts that emptied into the moat, a cesspit, or simply the outside of the castle wall. The smell was significant, though the garderobe's name, meaning wardrobe, suggests that clothes were sometimes stored there because the ammonia fumes helped kill fleas and moths. Bathing was infrequent, partly because heating enough water for a bath was a major undertaking and partly because the church sometimes taught that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness was sinful vanity. Most people washed their hands and faces daily but bathed their whole bodies only occasionally, perhaps a few times a year. Fact 13. The kitchen in a large castle was a busy and dangerous place, with open fires burning constantly and large quantities of food being prepared for the lord's household. Because of the fire risk, kitchens were often located in separate buildings or at least at some distance from the main living quarters. Food was cooked over open flames in enormous fireplaces, roasted on spits turned by servants or by dogs running in treadmill wheels, or baked in large bread ovens. A great household might employ dozens of kitchen workers, from the chief cook who planned menus and supervised everything to the lowly scullions who scrubbed pots and turned spits. Feeding a castle's inhabitants, which might number in the hundreds, was a major logistical operation requiring careful planning and management. Fact 14. Medieval food varied enormously depending on social class and season. The lord and his family ate relatively well, with access to meat, fish, bread made from fine wheat flour, and imported luxuries like sugar and spices. Peasants ate much more simply, with coarse bread made from rye or barley, pottage, which was a thick stew of vegetables and sometimes meat or fish, cheese, and whatever fruits and vegetables were in season. Everyone's diet changed dramatically through the year, with plenty in summer and fall after the harvest and scarcity in winter and spring when stored food ran low and fresh food was unavailable. The church mandated frequent fasting days when meat was forbidden, which meant that fish was important even for those living far from the sea. Fact 15. Spices were treasured in medieval cooking, not primarily to disguise the taste of spoiled meat as is sometimes claimed, but because they were exotic luxuries that displayed the host's wealth and because medieval tastes genuinely preferred highly spiced food. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg traveled thousands of miles from Asia to reach European tables, passing through many hands and accumulating enormous markups along the way. Pepper was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency, and wealthy men might pay their rent in peppercorns. Saffron, derived from crocus flowers and requiring enormous labor to harvest, was literally worth its weight in gold. Using these spices generously in food demonstrated that the host could afford such luxuries and was willing to share them with his guests. Fact 16. Knights were the elite warriors of medieval society, heavily armored cavalry who dominated the battlefield for centuries. The word knight comes from the Old English word knight, meaning servant or boy, reflecting the origins of knighthood in the household warriors who served great lords. Over time, knights developed into a distinct social class with their own code of behavior, rituals of initiation, and cultural ideals. A knight was expected to be brave in battle, loyal to his lord, generous to his followers, courteous to ladies, and protective of the weak and helpless. These ideals of chivalry, from the French word for horseman, shaped how knights were supposed to behave, though reality often fell short of the ideal. Fact 17. Becoming a knight was a long process that began in childhood. Around age 7, a boy of noble birth would be sent to the household of another lord to begin his training. As a page, he would learn the basic skills of riding and fighting while also serving at table, running errands, and learning the manners and customs of noble society. Around age 14, he would become a squire, essentially an apprentice knight who served a specific knight, caring for his armor and horses, accompanying him into battle, and continuing his martial training. Finally, around age 21, if he had proven himself worthy, he would be dubbed a knight in a ceremony that might range from a simple tap on the shoulder with a sword to an elaborate ritual involving an all-night vigil, a ceremonial bath, and a religious service. Fact 18. A knight's armor evolved dramatically over the medieval period, becoming progressively more protective and more expensive. Early medieval knights wore mail armor, flexible garments made of thousands of interlocking metal rings that could stop a sword cut but offered less protection against crushing blows or arrows. Over time, pieces of solid plate armor were added to protect vulnerable areas like the knees, elbows, and chest. By the 15th century, knights wore complete suits of plate armor that covered them from head to toe, weighing 60 pounds or more but distributing the weight across the body so a fit man could move, fight, and even do acrobatic feats while wearing it. A full suit of plate armor was enormously expensive, costing as much as a small farm, which is one reason why knights came almost exclusively from wealthy families. Fact 19. The knight's primary weapon was the lance, a long wooden spear designed for charging on horseback. A knight would couch his lance under his arm, aiming it at his opponent while his horse's momentum provided devastating force. A direct hit could unhorse an opponent, punch through armor, and kill instantly. If the lance broke, which it often did on impact, the knight would draw his sword for close combat. Medieval swords were not the heavy, clumsy weapons sometimes portrayed in movies but precision instruments, carefully balanced and razor-sharp, designed for both cutting and thrusting. A knight might also carry a mace or warhammer for crushing armored opponents, a dagger for close fighting, and perhaps an axe or polearm depending on the situation. Fact 20. The warhorse was as important to a knight as his armor and weapons. A destrier, the finest type of warhorse, was a large, powerful animal trained to charge into battle, kick and bite opponents, and respond instantly to its rider's commands. These horses were enormously expensive, sometimes costing more than everything else a knight owned combined. Knights might own several horses for different purposes, a destrier for battle, a palfrey for ordinary riding, and a rouncey or pack horse for carrying equipment. The relationship between a knight and his warhorse was close and essential. A knight without a horse was at a severe disadvantage in battle, which is why capturing an opponent's horse was often more valuable than killing the opponent himself. Fact 21. Tournaments were elaborate military exercises where knights could practice their skills, display their prowess, and win fame and fortune without the chaos and uncertainty of actual war. Early tournaments were little more than organized battles between groups of knights, fought over miles of countryside with real weapons and significant casualties. Over time, tournaments became more regulated and ceremonial, with individual jousting matches replacing the mass battles, blunted weapons reducing fatalities, and elaborate rules governing behavior. A successful tournament knight could win valuable prizes, including the horses and armor of defeated opponents, and could attract the attention of wealthy patrons. Some knights made their livings primarily through tournament winnings, traveling from one tournament to another across Europe. Fact 22. Jousting was the most prestigious tournament event, a one-on-one contest between mounted knights armed with lances. The two knights would charge at each other along a fence called a tilt, which kept their horses from colliding, each trying to strike the other squarely while avoiding being struck himself. Points were awarded for breaking lances against the opponent's shield or body, with more points for striking the helmet or unhorsing the opponent entirely. The knight who scored the most points, or who remained mounted while his opponent fell, won the match. Jousting was dangerous despite precautions, and knights were sometimes killed even in friendly competition. The risk was part of the appeal, demonstrating courage and providing a substitute for the thrill of actual combat. Fact 23. The code of chivalry governed how knights were supposed to behave, though like all ideals, it was more aspiration than reality. A knight was expected to be brave, facing danger without showing fear and never fleeing from an enemy. He was expected to be loyal, keeping his word and serving his lord faithfully even at the cost of his life. He was expected to be generous, sharing his wealth with followers and giving liberally to the church and the poor. He was expected to be courteous, especially to women and those of higher rank, showing refined manners and gentle speech. And he was expected to protect the weak, defending widows, orphans, and the innocent from oppression. These ideals were celebrated in songs and stories, creating a model of knightly behavior that influenced European culture for centuries. Fact 24. Courtly love was an elaborate cultural tradition that idealized romantic love between a knight and a noble lady, usually one who was married to someone else. The knight would devote himself to his lady, performing deeds of valor in her honor, writing poetry praising her beauty and virtue, and suffering exquisite torment because his love could never be fulfilled. Whether this tradition reflected actual behavior or was purely literary fantasy is debated by historians. What is clear is that the literature of courtly love, including the romances of King Arthur and his knights, shaped how medieval people thought about love, honor, and proper behavior between the sexes. The idea that love should be passionate, idealized, and somewhat painful became deeply embedded in Western culture and still influences our expectations of romance today. Fact 25. The reality of warfare in the medieval period was far grimmer than the romantic ideal of chivalric combat suggested. Battles were chaotic, terrifying, and brutal, with knights and common soldiers alike hacking at each other with weapons designed to maim and kill. The famous knights whose deeds were celebrated in song made up only a small fraction of medieval armies, which also included infantry armed with spears, bows, and halberds, as well as archers, crossbowmen, and eventually gunners. Siege warfare, in which armies surrounded castles or cities and tried to starve them into submission or breach their walls, was far more common than open battle and could drag on for months or even years. Disease killed more soldiers than combat, and even minor wounds often proved fatal in an age before antibiotics or effective surgery. Fact 26. The Crusades were military expeditions launched by Christian Europe to capture or defend the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim control. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099 and establishing several Crusader states in the Middle East. Subsequent crusades attempted to defend these states, recapture territories lost to Muslim counterattacks, or pursue other goals that had little to do with the Holy Land. The Crusades brought Europeans into direct contact with the more advanced civilizations of the Islamic world and Byzantium, introducing new ideas, technologies, and trade goods to Western Europe. They also left a legacy of religious violence and cultural conflict that continues to shape relations between the Western and Islamic worlds today. Fact 27. The Knights Templar were a military religious order founded around 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Combining the roles of monk and warrior, the Templars took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while also training as formidable fighters. Their distinctive white mantles with red crosses became famous throughout Europe and the Middle East. The Templars grew enormously wealthy through donations, developing a banking system that allowed pilgrims to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land, avoiding the risk of carrying valuables through dangerous territory. This wealth eventually attracted the envy of King Philip IV of France, who accused the Templars of heresy and had many of them arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake in 1307. The order was officially dissolved in 1312, but legends about Templar secrets and hidden treasure persist to this day. Fact 28. The Catholic Church was the dominant institution of medieval Europe, shaping virtually every aspect of life from birth to death and beyond. The Church taught that salvation could be achieved only through its sacraments, which gave it enormous power over a population that believed deeply in heaven and hell. Church courts had jurisdiction over many matters that would today be handled by secular authorities, including marriage, inheritance, and moral offenses. The Church owned vast amounts of land, perhaps a third of all land in Western Europe, and collected tithes, essentially a 10% tax, from everyone. Bishops and abbots were often as wealthy and powerful as secular lords, and the Pope claimed authority over all Christian rulers, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Fact 29. Medieval Christianity was intensely focused on sin, death, and the afterlife in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Everyone believed that death might come at any moment and that what happened after death depended entirely on the state of one's soul. Heaven offered eternal bliss in the presence of God, while hell offered eternal torment in fire and darkness. Between them, according to developing church doctrine, was purgatory, where souls were purified of lesser sins before being admitted to heaven. The living could help the dead in purgatory through prayers, masses, and charitable acts performed in their memory. This belief motivated the foundation of countless churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions, as the wealthy sought to ensure that prayers would be said for their souls after death. Fact 30. Monasteries were communities of monks or nuns who withdrew from the world to devote themselves to prayer, study, and work. Following rules established by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, monks divided their days between communal worship, private prayer, manual labor, and reading. Monasteries became centers of learning and literacy in a largely illiterate society, preserving classical texts, producing beautifully illuminated manuscripts, and educating the sons of nobles. They also provided social services including hospitals, schools, and hospitality for travelers. Great monasteries accumulated enormous wealth through donations, which some used for charitable purposes and others used to live in considerable comfort. The tension between the ideals of poverty and simplicity and the reality of institutional wealth was a recurring theme in medieval religious life. Fact 31. Cathedrals were the greatest architectural achievements of the medieval period, enormous stone churches that took generations to build and still inspire awe today. The Gothic cathedrals of the 12th through 14th centuries, with their pointed arches, flying buttresses, and enormous stained glass windows, represent an extraordinary achievement of engineering and artistry. Buildings like Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, and Cologne Cathedral soared to heights that would not be exceeded until the invention of modern steel frame construction. The colored light streaming through their windows created interiors meant to suggest the beauty of heaven. Building a cathedral was a communal effort involving entire cities over many decades, expressing both devotion to God and civic pride in creating something magnificent that would endure for centuries. Fact 32. Stained glass windows were more than decoration in medieval cathedrals. They were picture books in an age when most people could not read. Biblical stories, lives of saints, and moral lessons were depicted in brilliant colors that glowed when sunlight passed through them. The great rose windows that adorned many cathedrals were particular marvels, their intricate patterns of colored glass creating spectacular displays of light and color. Creating these windows required extraordinary skill, from designing the compositions to cutting and assembling thousands of pieces of glass to leading them together into panels that could withstand the elements. The windows of Chartres Cathedral, many of which survive from the 13th century, are considered among the finest artistic achievements of the medieval period. Fact 33. Peasants made up the vast majority of the medieval population, perhaps 90% or more in most times and places. Most peasants were not free farmers but serfs, bound to the land they worked and subject to the authority of the lord who owned that land. Serfs could not leave the manor without permission, could not marry without permission, and owed their lord various dues and services including labor on his fields. In exchange, they had the right to work strips of land for their own sustenance and could not be arbitrarily expelled. Life for a peasant was hard, with long hours of physical labor, poor diet, primitive housing, and vulnerability to disease, famine, and violence. Yet peasants were not merely victims, they had their own customs, communities, and pleasures, and sometimes they resisted their lord's demands through foot-dragging, evasion, or occasionally outright revolt. Fact 34. A medieval village was typically a small cluster of houses surrounded by open fields where the villagers worked. The houses were simple structures of wood, wattle and daub, which is woven sticks covered with clay, or occasionally stone, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. A single room might house an entire family along with their animals, which provided both additional warmth and considerable smell. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a table, a few stools, and beds that were often just straw-stuffed sacks on the floor or on simple wooden frames. Cooking was done over an open fire, creating constant smoke and soot. Light came from the fire and perhaps a few candles or rushlights, meaning that most activities ceased when darkness fell. Fact 35. The agricultural year shaped peasant life, with different tasks dominating each season. Spring was plowing time, when heavy plows pulled by teams of oxen broke up the soil for planting. Summer brought the constant work of weeding, keeping animals out of the growing crops, and beginning to harvest early crops like hay. Autumn was the busiest time, when the main grain harvest had to be brought in before rain or frost could ruin it. This was also the time for slaughtering animals that could not be fed through the winter and preserving their meat by salting or smoking. Winter was relatively quiet, a time for repairing tools, caring for animals, and perhaps a bit of rest before the cycle began again. This agricultural rhythm, tied to the seasons and the weather, had remained essentially unchanged since ancient times. Fact 36. The Black Death was the greatest catastrophe of the medieval period, a pandemic that killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. The disease, probably bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, arrived in Europe on ships from the east, carried by fleas that lived on rats. It spread with terrifying speed, killing its victims within days and leaving survivors traumatized and bewildered. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities lost half their populations or more. The social fabric frayed as people fled infected areas, refused to care for sick family members, and abandoned bodies in the streets. No one understood what caused the plague or how to stop it, leading to desperate measures including persecution of Jews, flagellant processions, and elaborate medical theories that did nothing to help. Fact 37. The aftermath of the Black Death transformed European society in ways that were still unfolding centuries later. With so many workers dead, those who survived could demand higher wages and better conditions, undermining the feudal system that had bound peasants to the land. Land that had been carefully cultivated for generations was abandoned, reverting to forest or pasture. Some villages disappeared entirely, their sites still visible in the English countryside as lumps and hollows in fields. The Church's authority was shaken by its inability to explain or prevent the disaster. A new focus on death and decay appeared in art and literature, while at the same time some survivors adopted an attitude of enjoying life while it lasted. The plague would return periodically for centuries, though never again with the devastating impact of that first great pandemic. Fact 38. Medieval medicine was based on theories inherited from the ancient Greeks, particularly the idea that health depended on the balance of four bodily fluids called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was understood as an imbalance of these humors, to be treated by restoring balance through diet, drugs, or procedures like bloodletting that removed excess humors. While this system was logical within its own framework, it had little basis in reality, and treatments based on it often did more harm than good. Bleeding a patient who was already weakened by disease, for example, was unlikely to help and might well kill. Yet medieval physicians were not fools, and their careful observations of symptoms and disease progression contributed to the eventual development of more effective medical science. Fact 39. Surgery in the medieval period was painful, dangerous, and generally a last resort. Without anesthesia, patients had to be held down while surgeons cut into them, and many died from shock or blood loss during procedures. Without understanding of infection, surgical wounds frequently became septic, often killing patients who had survived the operation itself. Yet medieval surgeons did perform operations including removing bladder stones, treating cataracts, setting broken bones, and amputating limbs. Military surgeons gained experience treating battlefield wounds, learning to remove arrows and treat the ghastly injuries caused by swords, axes, and eventually firearms. Barber surgeons, who combined cutting hair with minor medical procedures like pulling teeth and lancing boils, were available in most towns and villages. Fact 40. Towns and cities grew throughout the medieval period, becoming centers of trade, manufacturing, and increasingly, political power. Medieval towns were crowded, noisy, and by modern standards, incredibly filthy. Houses crowded together along narrow streets, their upper stories often projecting out to gain extra space until neighbors could almost shake hands across the street. Waste of all kinds was thrown into the streets, where it mixed with mud and animal droppings to create an ooze that was particularly vile in wet weather. Water came from wells and rivers that were often contaminated by this waste. Fire was a constant danger in cities built largely of wood, and devastating fires periodically swept through major cities, destroying thousands of buildings and killing hundreds of people. Fact 41. Despite their filth and danger, medieval towns offered opportunities unavailable in the countryside. Townspeople were free from the feudal obligations that bound peasants to the land, and a serf who escaped to a town and lived there for a year and a day was legally free. Towns were centers of trade where goods from across Europe and beyond were bought and sold. They were centers of manufacturing where craftsmen produced everything from shoes to swords to works of art. They were centers of learning where schools and eventually universities trained lawyers, physicians, and theologians. And they were centers of a new kind of social organization, where citizens governed themselves through elected councils rather than hereditary lords. Fact 42. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants that regulated their trades and looked after their members' interests. A guild set standards for quality, regulated prices, determined who could practice the trade, and provided mutual aid to members in need. A young man who wanted to become a craftsman would apprentice himself to a master for several years, learning the trade while working without pay. After completing his apprenticeship, he became a journeyman, working for wages while honing his skills. Finally, if he could produce a masterwork demonstrating his ability and could afford the fees, he might be admitted to the guild as a master, able to set up his own shop and train his own apprentices. This system ensured quality and protected established craftsmen, though it also limited competition and made it difficult for newcomers to enter trades. Fact 43. Trade expanded dramatically during the High Middle Ages, connecting Europe to the wider world as never before. Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa dominated Mediterranean trade, importing luxury goods from the East including silk, spices, and precious stones. Northern European trade centered on the Hanseatic League, a confederation of German trading cities that controlled commerce in the Baltic and North Seas, dealing in furs, timber, fish, and cloth. Great fairs held at regular intervals brought merchants from across Europe together to exchange goods and settle accounts. New financial techniques including bills of exchange, letters of credit, and double-entry bookkeeping facilitated commerce over long distances. The growth of trade created new wealth, new opportunities, and new ways of thinking about the world. Fact 44. The 100 Years' War between England and France, lasting from 1337 to 1453, was one of the defining conflicts of the late Middle Ages. Despite its name, it was not continuous warfare but a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities stretching over more than a century. The war began as a dispute over the French throne and English possessions in France, but it evolved into a broader struggle that reshaped both kingdoms. The English won spectacular victories at Crécy and Agincourt, where English longbowmen devastated French cavalry, but ultimately lost the war when French forces, inspired by Joan of Arc, turned the tide in the 1420s. By the war's end, England had lost almost all its French territories, and both countries had been transformed by the long conflict. Fact 45. Joan of Arc was a peasant girl who claimed to hear the voices of saints telling her to help the French king drive the English from France. In 1429, at age 17, she convinced the desperate French court to let her lead an army to relieve the siege of Orleans. Against all expectations, she succeeded, turning the tide of the war and enabling the coronation of King Charles VII. She was captured by the English and their Burgundian allies in 1430 and tried for heresy and witchcraft. Found guilty, she was burned at the stake in 1431, still only 19 years old. 25 years later, a new trial cleared her name, and in 1920, she was declared a saint by the Catholic Church. Her story captures both the religious fervor and the brutal violence of the medieval world. Fact 46. The longbow was one of the most effective weapons of the medieval period, capable in skilled hands of penetrating armor at 200 yards or more. English and Welsh archers trained from childhood, developing the strength to draw bows with pull weights of over 100 pounds. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, creating a deadly rain of missiles that could devastate cavalry charges before they reached their target. The longbow gave English armies a crucial advantage in the 100 Years' War, contributing to victories at Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, and Agincourt in 1415. Yet the longbow's importance eventually waned as armor improved and gunpowder weapons became more effective. By the end of the medieval period, firearms were beginning to replace bows on European battlefields. Fact 47. Gunpowder weapons appeared in Europe in the 14th century, initially crude and unreliable but gradually improving until they transformed warfare. The earliest guns were little more than tubes that projected stones or metal balls using the explosive force of burning gunpowder. Cannons grew larger and more powerful, eventually able to batter down castle walls that had withstood centuries of conventional siege. Smaller guns, the ancestors of rifles and pistols, became effective enough to threaten armored knights. The development of gunpowder weapons is often cited as marking the end of the medieval period, as the castles and armored cavalry that had dominated warfare for centuries became obsolete. The age of the knight was giving way to the age of the common soldier armed with a gun. Fact 48. Education in the medieval period was closely tied to the church, which needed literate clergy to perform religious services and administer its vast organization. Cathedral schools and monastery schools trained boys, and occasionally girls, in reading, writing, and the basics of Latin, the language of the church and of learning. Higher education was available at universities, which began appearing in the 12th century at places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. Students studied the 7 liberal arts, which were divided into the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Those who completed this course of study could go on to advanced work in theology, law, or medicine. University graduates found employment as clergy, administrators, lawyers, and teachers, forming a growing educated class that would eventually transform European society. Fact 49. Books in the medieval period were precious objects, each one copied by hand from an existing book in a process that might take months or years. Monasteries maintained scriptoria, rooms where monks spent their days copying texts onto parchment made from animal skins. Important books were illuminated with elaborate decorations, including decorated initial letters, borders of intricate designs, and miniature paintings illustrating the text. The materials alone, parchment and ink and gold leaf, were expensive, and the labor of skilled scribes was more so. A single book might cost as much as a house. Libraries were small by modern standards, a collection of a few hundred books being substantial. Knowledge was limited by the simple fact that there were not enough books in existence for most people ever to see one. Fact 50. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, transformed the production of books and ultimately transformed European civilization. Gutenberg's innovation was not printing itself, which had existed in Asia for centuries, but the development of movable metal type that could be rearranged to print different pages. A printing press could produce hundreds of identical copies of a book in the time it took a scribe to produce one, dramatically reducing the cost of books and making them available to people who could never have afforded handwritten manuscripts. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's invention, printing presses were operating throughout Europe, producing millions of books on every subject. The explosion of printed material made possible the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the spread of literacy that transformed the modern world. Fact 51. Women in medieval society occupied a subordinate position, legally and socially dependent on fathers, husbands, or other male relatives. A woman's primary role was expected to be as wife and mother, managing the household while her husband dealt with the outside world. Noblewomen might manage large estates in their husband's absence, and some wielded considerable informal power, but formal authority belonged to men. Peasant women worked alongside their husbands in the fields while also bearing children, cooking, cleaning, and performing the endless tasks of household maintenance. Some women found independence in religious life, becoming nuns who might rise to positions of considerable authority within their communities. A few exceptional women achieved fame as rulers, writers, or mystics, but most lived and died in obscurity, their stories unrecorded by history. Fact 52. Marriage in medieval society was primarily an economic and political arrangement rather than a romantic one. For the nobility, marriage was a way to forge alliances, secure inheritance rights, and merge estates. For peasants, it was a way to combine resources and share labor. Love was certainly possible within marriage, and some couples seem to have been genuinely devoted to each other, but it was not expected as a prerequisite. Among the nobility, marriages were often arranged when the parties were children, with the wedding taking place when they were old enough to consummate the union, typically around 12 for girls and 14 for boys. The church required consent from both parties for a valid marriage, which provided some protection against completely forced unions, but family pressure was intense and refusal was rare. Fact 53. Children in medieval society were expected to contribute to the family economy from an early age. Peasant children helped with farm work, watching animals, scaring birds from crops, and performing whatever tasks their small bodies could manage. Children of craftsmen began learning their father's trades as soon as they were able. Noble children were sent away from home around age 7 to learn the skills appropriate to their station in other households. Childhood as we understand it, a protected time of play and education separate from adult responsibilities, largely did not exist. Mortality rates were high, with perhaps a third of all children dying before age 5, which may have affected how much emotional investment parents were willing to make in individual children. Yet parents clearly loved their children, mourning when they died and celebrating when they thrived. Fact 54. Entertainment in the medieval period took many forms, from simple pleasures to elaborate spectacles. Music and dancing were popular at all levels of society, with everyone from peasants to kings enjoying song and dance. Storytelling was central to medieval culture, with tales of heroes and saints, of love and adventure, passed down through generations. Games and sports included chess and backgammon, dice and cards, ball games and wrestling, and for the nobility, hunting and hawking. Religious festivals provided regular occasions for celebration, with feasting, drinking, and entertainments that might include plays, processions, and public spectacles. Even executions could be public entertainment, drawing crowds to witness the death of criminals and traitors. Life was hard, but medieval people found ways to enjoy themselves. Fact 55. Hunting was the favorite pastime of the medieval nobility, a sport that combined physical skill, social display, and practical benefit. Deer hunting was particularly prestigious, conducted with elaborate ritual and governed by complex rules about who could hunt which animals where. Falconry, hunting with trained birds of prey, was considered an especially refined pursuit, with different birds appropriate to different social ranks. The hunting of wild boar was dangerous and exciting, requiring courage and skill to face a large, aggressive animal armed only with a spear. Hunting parks and forests were jealously guarded, with severe penalties for poaching. For peasants, these restrictions meant that meat from large game was rarely available, even when animals destroyed their crops. The right to hunt was a privilege that clearly distinguished the nobility from those below them. Fact 56. The medieval period saw the creation of enduring literary masterpieces that still resonate today. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, offers a vivid portrait of medieval English society through the stories told by a group of pilgrims traveling to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, completed shortly before his death in 1321, takes readers on a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, offering theological meditation wrapped in vivid poetry. The tales of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, developed over centuries by multiple authors, created an enduring mythology of chivalry and romance. These works and many others reveal the thoughts, beliefs, and fantasies of medieval people while also achieving artistic heights that continue to move readers centuries later. Fact 57. King Arthur probably has some basis in historical fact, perhaps a Romano-British war leader who fought against Saxon invaders in the 6th century. But the Arthur of medieval legend, ruling from his castle of Camelot with his Queen Guinevere and his Knights of the Round Table, is largely a product of imagination. The legends developed over centuries, with French writers adding the themes of courtly love and the quest for the Holy Grail that became central to the stories. Arthur's knights, including Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, and Galahad, embodied the ideals of chivalry while also demonstrating its failures, as adultery, jealousy, and betrayal ultimately destroyed the fellowship. The legend of Arthur, with its themes of noble idealism and tragic downfall, captured something essential about how medieval people understood their world. Fact 58. Heresy, believing or teaching things contrary to church doctrine, was one of the most serious crimes in medieval society. The Church claimed exclusive authority to interpret religious truth, and those who disagreed were seen as threatening not just church authority but the very fabric of Christian society and the salvation of immortal souls. Major heretical movements, including the Cathars in southern France and the Lollards in England, attracted significant followings and were violently suppressed. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, sought out and prosecuted heretics using methods including torture and execution by burning. The treatment of heretics reveals the dark side of medieval Christianity, its willingness to use violence to enforce conformity and its intolerance of dissent. Fact 59. Jews occupied a precarious position in medieval Christian society. Officially tolerated because Christian theology held that their eventual conversion would signal the end times, Jews were nonetheless subject to legal restrictions, periodic persecution, and occasional mass violence. They were barred from owning land in most places and from practicing most trades, which pushed many into moneylending, a profession forbidden to Christians because the Church prohibited charging interest. This role earned Jews both the resentment of those who owed them money and the protection of kings who found Jewish financiers useful. Periodic outbreaks of violence, particularly during the Crusades and the Black Death, massacred Jewish communities that had existed for centuries. The position of medieval Jews illustrates how religious difference could make people vulnerable in a society that demanded conformity. Fact 60. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East, endured throughout the medieval period until its final fall in 1453. While Western Europe fragmented into feudal kingdoms, Byzantium maintained a centralized government, a professional army, and a sophisticated bureaucracy centered on its capital, Constantinople. Byzantine culture preserved ancient Greek learning, including texts that would later spark the European Renaissance when they reached the West. The Byzantine Church, which developed separately from the Roman Catholic Church and eventually split with it in the Great Schism of 1054, spread Orthodox Christianity to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, including Russia. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 sent shock waves through Europe and is often cited as one of the events marking the end of the medieval period. Fact 61. The medieval period shaped the world we live in today in ways that are often invisible but profound. National boundaries that emerged from medieval kingdoms still define European politics. Legal systems based on medieval precedents still structure how we resolve disputes. Universities founded in the medieval period still educate students. Cathedrals built by medieval craftsmen still inspire awe. And ideas about honor, love, and heroism that developed in medieval literature still influence how we tell stories and what we expect from heroes. The medieval period was not merely a dark age between the glories of Rome and the Renaissance but a creative, dynamic era that laid the foundations for modern Western civilization. Fact 62. The legend of Robin Hood, the outlaw who robbed from the rich to give to the poor, emerged in medieval England and has remained popular ever since. The earliest references to Robin Hood appear in the 14th century, though the legends may be older. Different versions place him in different times and places, from the reign of Richard the Lionheart to that of Edward II. His companions, including Little John, Friar Tuck, and Maid Marian, were added to the legend over time. Whether Robin Hood was based on a real person is unknown and probably unknowable. But the legend captured something that resonated deeply, the fantasy of a champion for the common people against corrupt authority, and it continues to inspire stories, films, and imaginings of medieval England today. Fact 63. Leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the medieval period, not because it was the deadliest but because of its visible disfigurement and the belief that it was highly contagious. Lepers were required to live apart from society, often in special hospitals called leper houses or lazarettos. They had to wear distinctive clothing, announce their presence with a bell or clapper, and avoid contact with healthy people. Medieval people saw leprosy as a divine punishment for sin, particularly for sexual sin, and lepers were sometimes treated with remarkable cruelty. Yet there was also a strand of medieval thought that saw caring for lepers as a particularly holy act, and some religious orders dedicated themselves to this work. By the end of the medieval period, leprosy was declining in Europe for reasons that are still not entirely clear. Fact 64. Pilgrimage was an important part of medieval religious life, a journey to a holy place in hopes of receiving spiritual merit, miraculous healing, or divine forgiveness. The greatest pilgrimage destination was Jerusalem, the city where Jesus had been crucified and risen from the dead, but its distance and the dangers of the journey meant that only a small percentage of medieval Christians ever made it there. More accessible were pilgrimage sites in Europe, including Rome, where St. Peter was buried, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, where St. James the Greater's relics were venerated, and Canterbury in England, where Thomas Becket had been martyred. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety and companionship, and their journeys could take months. The experience was part spiritual exercise, part adventure, and part vacation, combining devotion with the excitement of travel and new experiences. Fact 65. Relics, the physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, were enormously important in medieval Christianity. A church that possessed significant relics could attract pilgrims and the donations they brought. Relics were believed to retain something of the saints' holiness and power, making them effective intercessors with God. The most important relics were body parts of major saints, but churches also treasured items the saints had touched or used, dirt from holy places, and even chains that had bound martyrs. The demand for relics far exceeded the supply, leading to a thriving trade that included outright fraud. Verification was difficult, and some churches possessed multiple heads or other body parts of the same saint. Yet the belief in relics was sincere, and many medieval Christians experienced what they believed to be miraculous healings or other divine interventions through contact with these sacred objects. Fact 66. Christmas was celebrated in the medieval period, though in ways quite different from modern traditions. The religious observance commemorated the birth of Jesus Christ, but the season was also a time of feasting, drinking, and celebration that drew on older winter solstice traditions. The 12 days of Christmas, from December 25 to January 6, were a holiday period when work was suspended and social norms were sometimes inverted, with servants playing the role of masters for a day. Elaborate feasts featured special foods including mince pies and wassail, a spiced ale. Gift-giving occurred, though more commonly on New Year's Day or January 6, the Feast of the Epiphany, than on Christmas Day itself. Many traditions we associate with Christmas today, including decorated trees and Santa Claus, developed later, but the medieval period established Christmas as a major festive season. Fact 67. Death was a constant presence in medieval life in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully grasp. Infant mortality was extremely high, with perhaps a third of all children dying before age 5. Life expectancy for those who survived childhood was not dramatically lower than today, but disease, accident, and violence could strike at any age. The Black Death killed perhaps half of Europe's population in a few years, and plague returned periodically for centuries. Medieval people lived with death in a way that we, with our hospitals and antibiotics and relative safety, do not. This awareness shaped their culture, their religion, and their art, which frequently depicted death, decomposition, and the judgment that awaited all souls. Fact 68. The medieval period saw significant advances in technology, despite its reputation as a time of stagnation. The heavy plough, developed for the dense soils of northern Europe, dramatically increased agricultural productivity. The horse collar allowed horses to pull heavy loads without choking, making them effective for farm work and transportation. Water mills and later windmills harnessed natural forces to grind grain, full cloth, and perform other labor that had previously required human or animal power. Mechanical clocks, appearing in the 13th century, began to measure time with a precision previously impossible. Spectacles, invented in Italy in the late 13th century, extended the productive years of scholars and craftsmen whose eyes weakened with age. These and other innovations contributed to the economic growth and social changes of the High Middle Ages. Fact 69. The Vikings, Norse seafarers from Scandinavia, were a major force in early medieval Europe. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders attacked coastal settlements from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire, striking with terrifying speed and violence before disappearing with their plunder. But the Vikings were not merely raiders. They were also traders, establishing commercial networks that stretched from Baghdad to the North Atlantic. They were explorers who reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. And they were settlers who established kingdoms in England, Normandy, and Sicily. The Viking Age lasted roughly from the late 8th century to the late 11th century, after which the Scandinavian peoples became integrated into mainstream European Christian civilization. Fact 70. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 transformed English society and culture. When King Edward the Confessor died without clear heirs, the English nobles chose Harold Godwin's son as king. But William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne and that Harold had sworn to support his claim. William invaded England, and at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, his Norman cavalry defeated Harold's English infantry. Harold was killed, reputedly by an arrow through the eye, and William became king. The Norman conquest replaced the English ruling class with Norman lords, introduced Norman French as the language of government and aristocracy, and initiated massive building projects including the Tower of London and many castles and cathedrals. The effects are still visible in the English language, which absorbed thousands of words from Norman French. Fact 71. The Magna Carta, sealed by King John of England in 1215, is often celebrated as a foundation of modern democracy, though its immediate purpose was much narrower. Facing rebellion by his barons, John agreed to a document that limited royal power and guaranteed certain rights and privileges to his subjects. Most provisions addressed specific grievances of the barons, but some, including the requirement that no free man be imprisoned or punished except through lawful judgment, would later be interpreted as establishing fundamental principles of law. John repudiated the Magna Carta almost immediately, but it was reissued by subsequent kings and became a touchstone for those who sought to limit royal power. Centuries later, English colonists in America would invoke Magna Carta as precedent for their own claims to rights and self-government. Fact 72. Wales, Scotland, and Ireland had their own distinctive medieval histories, interacting with but never fully absorbed by medieval England. Wales remained divided among native Welsh princes until Edward I conquered it in the late 13th century, building a ring of massive castles to control the conquered territory. Scotland maintained its independence, defeating English attempts at conquest at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, though border warfare continued for centuries. Ireland was partially conquered by Norman lords in the 12th century, but English control never extended much beyond the area around Dublin known as the Pale, while native Irish lords maintained power in the rest of the island. The relationships among these peoples, shaped by medieval conflicts and conquests, would continue to generate tension and violence for centuries to come. Fact 73. Heraldry, the system of identifying individuals and families through distinctive symbols displayed on shields and banners, developed during the medieval period. As armor became more enclosing, covering the face with visored helmets, it became impossible to recognize individual knights in battle. Distinctive designs painted on shields solved this problem, allowing friends and enemies alike to identify warriors. These designs became hereditary, passed from father to son, and the system grew increasingly complex and regulated. Heralds, officials who tracked and regulated these designs, gave the system its name. Coats of arms conveyed information through colors, patterns, and symbols that followed specific rules. A knight's heraldic device proclaimed his identity, his lineage, and his achievements, serving functions similar to a modern logo or trademark. Fact 74. Medieval maps looked nothing like modern maps because medieval people understood geography differently than we do. The most common type of medieval map, called a TO map, showed the world as a circle divided into 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, with Jerusalem at the center. These maps were not meant to help people navigate but to express theological ideas about the world's structure and meaning. More detailed maps existed for specific purposes, including charts for sailors that accurately depicted coastlines and portolan charts that used compass bearings to plot routes between ports. The idea of mapping the entire world accurately would have seemed both impossible and unnecessary to medieval people, who rarely traveled far from home and understood their world primarily through religious rather than geographic frameworks. Fact 75. Alchemy, the attempt to transform base metals into gold and to discover the elixir of life that would grant immortality, occupied many medieval scholars. While its goals were ultimately impossible, alchemy contributed to the development of chemistry through the techniques and apparatus that alchemists developed. Alchemists learned to distill substances, extract essences, and identify chemical reactions that would later prove important to legitimate science. They also developed a symbolic language and mystical philosophy that influenced later occult traditions. Medieval people did not draw a clear line between science and magic as we do. Knowledge of the natural world was believed to include forces and principles that we would consider supernatural, and the boundaries between legitimate learning and forbidden sorcery were often unclear. Fact 76. Witchcraft beliefs existed throughout the medieval period, but large-scale witch trials were actually more characteristic of the early modern period that followed. Medieval people certainly believed in the reality of malicious magic and occasionally punished individuals accused of practicing it. But the systematic persecution of supposed witches, with accusations of devil worship, night flying, and secret gatherings, developed mainly after 1400 and reached its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries. The medieval church actually taught that many beliefs about witchcraft, including the idea that witches could fly or transform into animals, were illusions or superstitions. The intensive witch hunts that killed tens of thousands of people, mostly women, came later, as part of the religious and social upheavals of the Reformation era. Fact 77. The medieval period saw the development of national monarchies in Western Europe that would evolve into the modern nation-states of France, England, and Spain. Early medieval kings were little more than the most powerful of many competing lords, struggling to control their own vassals and constantly threatened by rivals. Over centuries, kings accumulated power through war, marriage, and administrative innovations that allowed them to tax and govern more effectively. The Hundred Years' War, despite its devastation, strengthened both the French and English monarchies by focusing national feeling and providing justification for expanded royal authority. By the end of the medieval period, kings ruled through bureaucracies that collected taxes, administered justice, and enforced royal will across increasingly unified territories. Fact 78. The late medieval period saw significant social unrest as peasants and urban workers challenged the established order. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England saw thousands of commoners march on London, demanding an end to serfdom and the reduction of taxes. They briefly seized control of the city before their leader Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations with the young King Richard II, and the revolt collapsed. Similar uprisings occurred across Europe, including the Jacquerie in France in 1358 and the Ciompi Revolt in Florence in 1378. These revolts were suppressed, often brutally, but they demonstrated that the medieval social order was not as stable as it appeared and foreshadowed the greater social transformations to come. Fact 79. The medieval warm period, lasting roughly from 900 to 1300, saw relatively mild temperatures that allowed agriculture to expand into previously marginal areas. Vineyards flourished in England, settlements spread into the mountains of Scandinavia, and the Norse established colonies in Greenland. Population grew significantly, perhaps doubling between 1000 and 1300. Then the climate changed. The Little Ice Age, beginning in the 14th century, brought colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and more variable weather. Harvests failed, famine spread, and the population that had grown during the warm period could no longer be sustained. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across Europe. Climate change, then as now, had profound effects on human societies. Fact 80. Gardens were important in medieval life, providing food, medicine, and pleasure. Peasants maintained small gardens near their homes, growing vegetables, herbs, and fruit to supplement their diets. Monastery gardens were more elaborate, including medicinal herb gardens, vegetable gardens, orchards, and sometimes pleasure gardens for contemplation. Castle gardens provided fresh produce for the Lord's table and pleasant spaces for recreation. The most elaborate gardens belonged to royalty, featuring fountains, arbors, and carefully cultivated flowers. Medieval garden design influenced later European gardens, with some features, including the enclosed garden surrounded by walls or hedges, persisting for centuries. In a world where most people rarely left their immediate vicinity, a well-designed garden could offer a small paradise of beauty and tranquility. Fact 81. The concept of time in the medieval period was quite different from our modern understanding. Mechanical clocks appeared only in the late medieval period and remained rare and unreliable. Most people told time by the sun's position or by the bells that rang the canonical hours, marking the times for monastic prayers and structuring the day for everyone within earshot. An hour's length varied with the season because daylight hours were divided into 12 equal parts regardless of how much actual daylight there was. This meant that summer hours were longer than winter hours. The week was structured around Sunday, the Lord's Day, and various saints' days throughout the year. Modern precision about time, with its minutes and seconds and appointments scheduled to the quarter hour, would have been meaningless to medieval people. Fact 82. Animals played crucial roles in medieval life far beyond what most modern people experience. Horses provided transportation and military power for those who could afford them. Oxen pulled plows and carts. Cattle, sheep, and goats provided milk, meat, wool, and leather. Pigs, which could feed themselves on forest mast and household scraps, were especially valuable to peasants. Chickens and geese provided eggs and meat. Dogs hunted, guarded, and provided companionship. Cats controlled mice in barns and homes. Falcons and hawks hunted for sport. Bees produced honey, the primary sweetener before sugar became available. Animals were essential economic assets, and their loss to disease or theft could be catastrophic for families that depended on them. Fact 83. The medieval church calendar structured the year around religious observances that gave meaning to the passage of time. The great feasts of Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were times of celebration and rest from work. The seasons of Advent and Lent were times of fasting and penitence. Saints' days, scattered throughout the year, honored the holy men and women whose examples inspired the faithful and whose intercession was sought in prayer. Many saints' days became associated with particular customs, crafts, or agricultural tasks, creating a rhythm of observance that connected everyday activities to sacred meaning. This calendar provided a structure that made the year comprehensible and gave people regular occasions for both solemnity and celebration. Fact 84. Bells were the dominant sounds of medieval life, marking time, summoning people to church, warning of danger, and celebrating occasions of joy. Every church and monastery had bells that rang the canonical hours, dividing the day into periods for prayer and work. Town bells summoned citizens to meetings, announced the opening and closing of markets, and signaled curfew. Alarm bells warned of fire or enemy attack. Wedding bells and funeral bells marked the great transitions of life. The sound of bells carried across the countryside, reaching even those who could not see a clock or read the sky, binding communities together in shared awareness of the passing hours and the activities they brought. Fact 85. Death rituals in the medieval period were elaborate and communal affairs. When death approached, a priest would be summoned to administer last rites, hearing confession, giving communion, and anointing the dying person with holy oil. After death, the body would be washed and wrapped in a shroud, then watched overnight by family and neighbors. The funeral itself was a religious service, often including a requiem mass, followed by burial in consecrated ground. The wealthy might be buried inside churches, as close to the altar as their status allowed, while ordinary people were buried in churchyards. After burial, the living continued to remember the dead through prayers, masses, and commemorations on anniversary dates. Death was a community event, handled not by professionals but by family, friends, and neighbors. Fact 86. The medieval period left an indelible mark on the English language. English began the medieval period as a Germanic language related to German and Dutch. The Norman conquest introduced French as the language of the ruling class, and for centuries English absorbed French vocabulary wholesale. Legal terms like court, judge, jury, and attorney come from French. Governmental terms like parliament, council, and realm come from French. Culinary terms like beef, pork, and mutton come from French, reflecting the fact that Norman lords ate the meat while English peasants raised the animals, which is why we have English cow, pig, and sheep alongside French-derived beef, pork, and mutton. The Latin of the Church contributed another layer of vocabulary. Modern English, with its enormous vocabulary and flexible grammar, was shaped by these medieval influences. Fact 87. The Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to drive Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula, was a defining feature of medieval Spanish history. When Muslim forces conquered most of Iberia in the early 8th century, Christian kingdoms survived only in the mountainous north. Over the following centuries, these kingdoms gradually expanded southward, conquering territory from the Muslim Taifa kingdoms that had replaced the original Umayyad Caliphate. The Reconquista was not continuous warfare but alternating periods of conflict and coexistence, during which Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived side by side in a multicultural society unusual for medieval Europe. The Reconquista concluded in 1492 when Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, completing the Christian reconquest of Spain. Fact 88. Medieval architecture developed distinctive styles that expressed the values and beliefs of the age. Romanesque architecture, dominant from the 10th through 12th centuries, featured thick walls, round arches, and massive towers that conveyed strength and permanence. Gothic architecture, emerging in the 12th century and flourishing through the 15th, achieved soaring heights through pointed arches and flying buttresses that transferred weight outward, allowing walls to be filled with enormous stained glass windows. Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame, Chartres, and Cologne represented not just engineering achievements but theological statements, their height and light symbolizing aspiration toward heaven and the divine light of God. These buildings took generations to complete, with workers knowing they would never see the finished result, yet laboring to create something that would stand for centuries. Fact 89. Music in the medieval period ranged from simple folk songs to complex polyphonic compositions performed in cathedrals and royal courts. Gregorian chant, named for Pope Gregory the Great though probably developed over several centuries, was the music of the church, a single melodic line sung in unison by choirs of monks or clergy. Over time, composers began adding additional melodic lines, creating polyphony of increasing complexity. Secular music included songs of love and war performed by traveling minstrels, dance music for courtly entertainments, and folk songs that have mostly been lost because they were never written down. Musical notation developed during the medieval period, allowing compositions to be preserved and transmitted across time and distance, though medieval notation looked quite different from modern staff notation. Fact 90. Sports and games provided entertainment and sometimes served as military training. Tournaments and jousting have already been mentioned, but many other sports existed. Football, played with a ball that might be kicked or thrown, was popular despite periodic attempts to ban it because of the violence that often accompanied games. Archery, encouraged by governments that wanted a supply of trained bowmen, was both sport and civic duty. Wrestling, swimming, and various ball games provided recreation for all classes. Indoor games included chess, checkers, backgammon, and various card games after cards arrived in Europe in the late 14th century. Gambling accompanied many of these games, despite the Church's disapproval, adding excitement and sometimes leading to violent disputes. Fact 91. The end of the medieval period came not with a single event but through a gradual transformation that historians mark with various symbolic dates. Some cite the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, which ended the Byzantine Empire and sent Greek scholars fleeing to Western Europe with manuscripts that would fuel the Renaissance. Others point to 1492, when Columbus reached the Americas and Spain completed the Reconquista. Still others prefer 1517, when Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation by posting his 95 Theses. None of these dates represents a clean break. Medieval ways of life continued in many places long after the Renaissance and Reformation began elsewhere. But by the 16th century, Europe was clearly entering a new era, transformed by printing, gunpowder, exploration, and religious upheaval. Fact 92. The legacy of the medieval period surrounds us even today, often in ways we do not recognize. Our systems of law, government, and education have medieval roots. Our languages carry medieval vocabulary and structures. Our literature draws on medieval themes and forms. Our religious institutions, whether we participate in them or not, were shaped by medieval developments. Even our fantasy genre, with its dragons and wizards and sword-wielding heroes, derives largely from medieval imagination and medieval legend. When we imagine castles and knights, when we speak of chivalry and honor, when we enter Gothic churches or trace family names back through centuries, we connect with the medieval past that shaped so much of what we are today. Fact 93. The image of the medieval period as a dark age of ignorance and superstition is largely a myth created by later writers who wanted to emphasize the achievements of their own era. Medieval people were not more ignorant or superstitious than people of other eras, just different. They created works of art and architecture that still inspire wonder. They developed systems of law and government that evolved into modern institutions. They preserved classical learning through the so-called Dark Ages and built universities that still educate students today. They explored questions of philosophy and theology with sophistication and rigor. The medieval period had its share of cruelty and ignorance, as does every era including our own, but it was also a time of genuine achievement and enduring creation. Fact 94. Perhaps what most distinguishes the medieval world from our own is its sense of cosmic order and meaning. Medieval people believed they lived in a universe created and governed by God, in which everything had its place and purpose. The social hierarchy, from king to peasant, reflected divine order. The natural world displayed God's handiwork. History was moving toward a predetermined end when Christ would return and judge the living and the dead. This worldview provided certainty and meaning but also justified inequality and limited questioning. The transformation from this medieval cosmos to our modern universe of scientific laws and individual rights was not simply progress but a profound change in how human beings understood themselves and their world. Fact 95. As you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself once more approaching that castle in the fading light. The drawbridge has been raised, the portcullis lowered, the gates secured for the night. Within the walls, torches flicker and fires blaze in great hearths. Knights and ladies gather in the great hall, where minstrels tune their instruments and servants prepare for the evening meal. Outside, peasants return to their villages, their day's labor done, to eat simple suppers and sleep on straw beds until dawn brings another day of work. In monastery cells, monks prepare for the night office, prayers that will pierce the darkness and rise to heaven. The medieval world settles into night, secure in its certainties, unaware of the transformations to come. Fact 96. The castles the medieval lords built to protect themselves have become monuments that draw visitors from around the world. Their ruins dot the landscapes of Europe, from the highlands of Scotland to the hills of Spain, from the banks of the Rhine to the coast of the Holy Land. Some have been carefully preserved or restored, offering glimpses of how they once appeared. Others are picturesque ruins, their towers crumbling and their halls open to the sky. All of them testify to an age when local lords held power in their strong hands and defended it with stone walls and armored warriors. The age of castles has passed, but the castles themselves endure, reminders of a world that is gone but not entirely forgotten. Fact 97. The knights who rode through medieval Europe have become figures of legend, their real lives transformed into symbols of honor, courage, and romantic love. The reality was often different from the legend. Knights could be brutal, greedy, and treacherous as well as brave and loyal. The wars they fought were often sordid struggles for power and plunder rather than noble causes. The ladies they supposedly worshipped were real women with limited choices and constrained lives. Yet the ideal of knighthood, the vision of the armored warrior who protects the weak and serves the right, has persisted across centuries. It shapes how we tell stories, what we expect from heroes, and what we hope human beings can become. Fact 98. Tonight, as you float toward dreams, carry with you the echoes of the medieval world. The ring of hammer on anvil as a smith forges a sword. The chanting of monks in candlelit chapels. The clatter of hooves as knights ride to tournament or war. The laughter in great halls where minstrels sing of love and adventure. The prayers of peasants for good harvests and protection from plague. The cries of battle and the silence of siege. The bells that marked the hours and the cycles of the year. All of it now silent, all of it past. Yet somehow still present in the stones of castles and cathedrals, in the words we speak and the stories we tell, in the long memory of human civilization. Fact 99. The medieval world has passed, but it has not disappeared. It lives on in the institutions and ideas that shape our world, in the buildings and artworks that survive from those distant centuries, in the literature and legends that continue to inspire us. It lives on in our imagination, in the vision of castles and knights and fair ladies that captures something eternal about human hopes and fears. And tonight, as you sink into sleep, it lives on in these words, this journey through 1,000 years of human history, this invitation to dream of a world of stone walls and steel swords, of faith and fear, of darkness and flickering light. Sleep well, traveler. The drawbridge is raised, the castle secured. The medieval night enfolds you in its quiet embrace. May your dreams be filled with wonder, and may you wake refreshed to the world that the medieval people could never have imagined but helped, in their way, to create.